I never thought a few painted parking lines behind my building in downtown Portland would turn into a full-blown war over control, leverage, and pride. But that's exactly what happened. And looking back now, it still feels unreal how fast it escalated from something ordinary into something that started eating at every part of my life. My name is Mason Clark, and I own a mid-sized commercial property called Westbridge Commons. Nothing glamorous from the outside, just brick, glass, a little worn around the edges, but solid, reliable. The kind of building that quietly pays your bills and doesn't ask for much in return. And for almost a decade, that's exactly how it worked, especially because of one simple thing I never took for granted. The 12 parking spaces behind the building that were clearly marked, legally deeded, and reserved exclusively for my tenants. And in a downtown area like Portland where parking can make or break a lease, those 12 spots were basically gold. Everything ran smooth for years. Tenants came and went, but those spaces stayed untouched, respected, almost invisible in how well they worked, until the day Adrian Cole and Vanessa Hart moved into the building next door. They were a California couple, young, polished, the kind of people who always look like they're in the middle of building something bigger than the room they're standing in, and they bought the old warehouse next door to turn it into a tech hub they called Skybridge Labs. All open floor plans, glass walls, startup buzzwords, and contractors coming and going at all hours like the building itself was still trying to decide what it wanted to become. The first time I met Adrian, I actually thought we'd get along. He had that easy confidence, firm handshake, always smiling like nothing could really go wrong. And I remember specifically walking him out back and pointing to the property line, even mentioning those 12 parking spaces because I always make it a point to be clear with neighbors early. No confusion, no assumptions, just facts. And he nodded like he understood completely. Even joked about respecting boundaries, and I believed him. Because there was no reason not to, at least not yet. But the thing about confidence is it can hide a lot of intent. And I didn't realize at the time that what I saw as agreement was really just delay, because about 3 weeks later, everything changed with one phone call that started quiet and ended with my entire sense of control slipping out of my hands. It was Julia Bennett, one of my long-term tenants. She ran a small consulting firm on the second floor, very organized, very routine, the kind of person who notices when something even slightly off happens. And when she called me that afternoon, her voice wasn't just upset. It was confused in a way that immediately made my stomach tighten, because she told me her car was gone, not stolen in the dramatic sense, but gone from her assigned space behind the building. And all that was left was a bright orange towing notice sitting on the pavement like a signature on a mistake. At first I assumed it had to be an error, maybe city enforcement, maybe a misunderstanding with permits. But when I called the number on the notice, a man named Carl answered and told me the vehicle had been removed at the request of the adjacent property owner. And that sentence alone didn't make sense because I knew exactly what land he was talking about, and I knew exactly where my lines were drawn. I told him I was the owner of those spaces and there must be a mistake, but he didn't hesitate. He said Adrian Cole had contacted them directly, provided documentation, and claimed those spots were part of their overflow access for contractors. I remember sitting there in silence for a second, just trying to process how casually someone could rewrite reality with a phone call and a piece of paper, because from where I stood there was nothing unclear about those 12 spaces. They were mine, always had been, legally recorded, physically marked, consistently used that way for years. I called Adrian immediately, and when he picked up he sounded almost amused, like I was calling about something trivial instead of a tenant losing their vehicle. And I told him straight that his towing request had resulted in my tenant's truck being taken, and his response was so relaxed it almost made it worse. He said they needed temporary space for contractors, that the markings looked outdated anyway, and that my tenant could just pay the fee and get the vehicle back, and we'd figure things out later. Like we were discussing a scheduling inconvenience instead of a financial and legal violation. I told him clearly those spaces were deeded to Westbridge Commons, and that he needed to reverse everything immediately and reimburse the fee. And that's when the tone shifted, subtle at first, but unmistakable. He stopped sounding casual and started sounding rehearsed, like he had already decided what the conflict was going to be about long before I ever called. And he said their survey showed the boundary line differently, and that if I had an issue I should speak to their attorney. Then he hung up. I stayed in my office longer than I should have after that call, just staring at nothing, because I've been in commercial real estate long enough to know that most disputes are just misunderstandings that clear up quickly. But this didn't feel like a misunderstanding. It felt like someone had decided my property was negotiable and was now acting on that belief. That night, I called my attorney, a man named Richard Halston, someone who had been handling property law longer than I had even owned buildings, and I sent him everything: deeds, plats, survey records, all of it. And when he called me back, he didn't hesitate for even a second. He said there was no ambiguity. The 12 spaces were clearly part of my parcel, and what had happened wasn't a gray area. It was a clear overreach. That should have been the end of it: a letter, a correction, maybe an apology. But instead it turned into something slower and more frustrating, because Adrian's lawyer responded with carefully worded language about boundary interpretation and shared access assumptions, and even suggested splitting towing costs like we were negotiating a dinner bill instead of dealing with repeated interference on private property. I refused immediately, but while the legal process started crawling forward, something else began happening that made everything feel heavier, because it wasn't just Julia anymore. It was other tenants too. Different cars, different days, same outcome. Parked in my marked spaces and gone within hours. Each time ending up at the same towing company called Harborline Recovery, and each time I was the one absorbing the fallout. Reimbursing tenants, answering angry calls, trying to maintain stability in a building that was slowly starting to feel unstable. I remember one evening standing in the back lot watching a tow truck hook up a car under the dim streetlights. And what surprised me wasn't anger. It was how calculated it all felt, like someone had turned a simple parking arrangement into a pressure system designed to wear me down over time instead of breaking me all at once. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about misunderstanding property lines anymore. It was about leverage, and whoever controlled enforcement controlled the situation regardless of what the paperwork said. I called Adrian again, hoping there would be some rational point where he would step back. But all he said was take it to court, like that was supposed to make the ongoing damage irrelevant. And when I hung up that call, I remember thinking something I had never seriously considered before, that maybe winning this in court wouldn't be enough, because court doesn't stop what happens tomorrow morning in real time. And that was the first time I started thinking differently, not about fighting harder, but about how control actually works in situations like this. Because if someone else was using enforcement as a tool against me, then maybe the real question wasn't how to argue better, but who actually held the mechanism that made enforcement possible in the first place. And that thought, once it settled in, changed the direction of everything that came after, even though at the time I didn't fully understand just how far I was about to go. After that night in the lot, I stopped seeing this as a normal property dispute, because normal disputes don't bleed you slowly in real time while you're still waiting for paperwork to catch up. And that's exactly what was happening. Every morning started the same way: a tenant call, sometimes calm, sometimes already angry, always with the same ending: another car gone, another towing fee, another explanation from Harborline Recovery that they were just acting on instructions from the adjacent property owner. And the worst part wasn't even the money anymore. It was the shift in tone from my tenants. Because people don't stay patient forever when they feel like their own landlord can't protect the space they're paying for. Julia stopped calling me first and started texting updates like she was reporting incidents in a building that didn't belong to her anymore. And that hit me harder than anything Adrian had done directly, because it meant the damage wasn't just physical, it was psychological, slow erosion of trust that I could feel spreading through the lease renewals, through hallway conversations, through the way people looked at that back exit like it had become optional territory. My attorney Richard filed for emergency relief, conversion, trespass, interference with use, everything we could stack into a motion, and on paper we were solid: clean ownership, documented boundaries, repeated unauthorized enforcement. But courts don't operate on urgency the way real life does, and Adrian clearly understood that gap better than most people I've ever dealt with. While we waited for hearings and responses, Harborline kept operating like a machine that had no opinion on who was right, only who was paying them that day. And I remember one afternoon watching another vehicle get hooked up while a tenant stood there holding her phone like she was trying to record something that nobody would later care enough to watch. I went down to the lot once, not to confront the driver, just to see it with my own eyes at ground level. And the driver barely looked at me, just gave me the same line: property owner authorization, like that phrase alone erased everything else that mattered. That's when it started to sink in that Adrian wasn't just disputing my boundary. He was using infrastructure against me, because towing isn't about arguments. It's about immediate physical removal, and once a car is gone, the conversation shifts entirely to retrieval, fees, and inconvenience, not ownership. That realization sat heavy because it meant I wasn't just dealing with a legal disagreement, I was dealing with a system being used as pressure, and systems like that don't care about who's right. They care about who can keep it going longer. Richard suggested pushing harder legally, injunction, contempt warnings, escalation, but even he admitted it might take weeks before anything meaningful stopped the towing cycle. And I remember sitting across from him in his office thinking how absurd it was that something so immediate could only be addressed through something so slow. That night, I did something that surprised even me. I asked him for everything he could find on Harborline Recovery, not Adrian, not Vanessa, just the towing company itself, and at first he looked at me like I had lost focus. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the real leverage wasn't sitting in Adrian's office. It was sitting in whoever physically showed up with a hook and chain. So I started looking into them myself, quietly, almost obsessively, business filings, contracts, anything public I could get without making noise. And what I found wasn't a powerhouse operation. It was a fragile one. Harborline was small, undercapitalized, operating on thin margins, 2 trucks that were constantly in use, inconsistent cash flow, and a management structure that looked more like survival than strategy. That detail changed something in me, not immediately, but enough that I stopped thinking about this as purely defensive. A few days later, I went down to their yard, on the edge of an industrial strip where everything looked temporary even if it had been there for years, and I met the owner, a man named Owen Marsh, older than I expected, tired in a way that didn't come from one bad week, but from a long series of them. We talked at first about nothing relevant: weather, fuel costs, maintenance headaches, the usual small business conversations people have when they don't know each other yet. And I could tell he assumed I was just another property manager complaining about invoices. But then I asked him a simple question that shifted the entire direction of the conversation. I asked him what it would take to buy the company outright. All of it. Trucks, contracts, name, everything. He actually laughed at first, like it was a joke that didn't quite land, until he realized I wasn't laughing with him. And then the silence changed, because suddenly it wasn't a casual visit anymore. It was an offer sitting in the room between us that neither of us could ignore. Over the next 2 weeks, everything moved faster than the court system ever had. Numbers were discussed, assets evaluated, contracts reviewed, and all the while Adrian's towing operation kept running against my property like nothing had changed, completely unaware that the mechanism he was relying on was quietly being pulled into my hands from a completely different direction. Richard called once during that period to update me on another delay in court scheduling, and I remember listening to him while signing documents that effectively shifted control of Harborline Recovery into my name, and the contrast between those two systems, legal delay versus business execution, felt almost unreal sitting in the same moment. And when the final transfer was complete, I didn't announce it, I didn't call anyone, I just sat in my car outside the yard for a while, watching my own truck sitting there, and realized that from that point forward, every tow that had been used against me was now something I could directly control, not in theory, not in court, but in real time. And that's when I decided it was time to stop reacting altogether and change the structure of the entire situation. I didn't announce anything after the purchase. Not to Richard, not to my tenants, not even to myself in any meaningful way. I just remember sitting alone in my truck that evening outside the Harborline yard, watching the drivers come and go like it was any other day, except now every hook, every chain, every call they answered had a different weight behind it, even if nobody inside that system knew it yet. It's strange how control doesn't feel like power right away. It feels more like silence, like something that used to push against you suddenly stops pushing at all. The first real move I made was simple, almost boring on purpose. I issued full reimbursement orders for every towing fee that had ever come off my property through Harborline. No conditions, no disputes, just clean refunds back to tenants. Because I needed the people in my building to feel something they hadn't felt in weeks: stability. Julia called me the next morning, and there was a pause in her voice before she spoke, like she didn't quite believe what she was reading on her bank statement. And she asked me if this meant the situation was finally over, and I told her honestly I didn't know yet, but it wasn't going to stay the way it had been. Then I terminated Harborline's active service agreements with the adjacent property, effective immediately, and when that paperwork was processed, something very simple but very important changed in practice. Adrian no longer had a towing company on standby. I didn't call him right away. I waited a full day, partly because I wanted the absence of action to speak first, and when he finally called me, I could hear it immediately in his voice, that shift from confidence to confusion, because the system he had been using suddenly didn't behave the way it used to. He asked me if I had done something with Harborline, almost carefully, like he already knew the answer but didn't want to hear it confirmed, and I told him yes, I had purchased them, and there was a silence on the line that lasted longer than any of our previous conversations. Then he tried to reframe it, like people do when they realize the ground has changed under them, saying I was escalating things, that this wasn't how professional disputes were handled, and I remember actually laughing once, not because it was funny, but because of how quickly language changes when leverage moves sides. I told him I wasn't escalating anything. I was just removing access, and access is something people tend to take for granted until it disappears. After that call, the towing incident stopped immediately, not gradually, not partially, just gone, like someone had turned off a tap that had been running against me for weeks, and the sudden quiet in the back lot almost felt louder than the chaos had been. But the legal case was still moving, slow and inevitable, and that part of it I didn't control yet. When we finally got into court, Adrian came prepared the way people do when they've been confident for too long, with surveys, interpretations, alternate readings of the boundary line, but none of it carried the weight he thought it would once the actual deed records were laid out clearly in front of Judge Morrison. There was no ambiguity, no gray area that could be stretched into leverage, just a clean legal boundary that had been ignored long enough to cause damage. The judge ruled in my favor on all key points, confirmed ownership of the 12 spaces, ordered reimbursement of all towing fees, and required Adrian to cover legal costs. And I remember sitting there listening to it all feeling something that wasn't excitement or relief exactly. More like a long exhale after holding your breath for too long without realizing it. Adrian didn't say much after the ruling, just gathered his papers with this tight expression like he was already trying to rewrite the story in his head on the way out of the courtroom. And that could have been the end of it, a clean legal resolution, a quiet return to normal. But what stayed with me wasn't the court decision. It was how easily something stable had been turned into conflict just because someone believed they could push the boundary long enough for reality to bend. A few weeks later, I walked through the back lot again. The same 12 spaces, the same paint, the same silence, and I found myself thinking about how thin the line really is between order and disruption when enforcement becomes a weapon instead of a neutral system. Adrian never apologized, not once, and maybe that was the most honest part of the entire story, because it confirmed that for him, this was never about misunderstanding, it was about control. Now I still own those 12 spaces, but I think about them differently, not as parking, but as a reminder that most conflicts don't end when someone is right. They end when someone loses access to the system they were using to be wrong. And I'm curious what you would have done in my place. Would you have stayed purely legal and waited it out? Or would you have stepped into the leverage game the way I did to stop the damage in real time? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I read them. And if you want more stories like this where business, law, and human ego collide in ways nobody expects, make sure to like and subscribe because the next one might push this even further than you think is possible.